we spent a lot of time reading, and in the summers we'd spend a lot of time borrowing books from the library and competing with readings, my siblings. So I'd had this passion for literature. But when I entered high school, the school was structured in such a way that all the top students in the third form were forced into one with the top fourth form group, which was a science stream. So all bright students must do science. And I wasn't too keen on science, and worse, they told me that there was blood concerned in medical doctors dealing with patients, and I just knew that it wouldn't be. But I had this passion for literature, and I was influenced by my history teacher and my math teacher, who were extraordinary teachers, and they felt that there was a need for more men to be teaching, and they started to encourage some of us, and I caught on with that idea and realized after a while I wanted to teach, and if I didn't teach I would die. And I had huge arguments with my fellow students who kept saying, but Bucknor, why you? Because part of the thing in Jamaica is that teachers were not well paid. And so one of the question was, how would you survive, you know, as a man, you know, with this traditional role of taking care of a family and so on. And but I knew, and when my mother said to me, you know that teachers won't get well paid, but she heard the passion in my voice and she said, well, if that's what you want to do, go ahead. And in that gave me the liberation to do that, and it made me make these choices. But I've often felt that if I didn't teach, I would die. I think it's very important for somebody who has two young children, two young boys, who often play school. The model that they have been encountered in school is a female figure, you know, and they're playing these roles in the very way that these female teachers play teacher or act as teachers. I think also it's important for people to recognize, I mean, especially as a male teacher teaching English literature, I don't think there is any surprise to find a male teacher teaching science and maths. Yeah, it's almost the norm. In fact, in engineering faculties and science faculties, oftentimes prior to the shift in gender norms for university education in Jamaica, for example, those fields were predominantly men. Yeah, but hardly you find a man teaching English literature. It's seen as one of these softer, you know, and I went to an all-boys school. It's a softer discipline, you know, it's not hardcore facts kind of thing. And I think it's important for male teachers to recognize that there's a whole gamut of expression of masculinity, you know, that men can have a tough side and a soft side, yeah, and to teach English literature is not necessarily to compromise your sense of your masculinity. Yeah, and so part of the symbolism of men in teaching is to also, in a general way, provide models for young men in the teaching profession. But secondly, to expand, especially when you think of a subject like English literature, to expand what it is that a man can do, and it's okay. Yeah, to reinforce that. I think also that there's a level at which students will find a sense of affinity. In teaching in an all-boys school, there's a sense in which there is a sense of affinity with a male figure that they can talk to about some issues that men are going through. And I think that that's kind of part of the role of a male teacher in an institution as well. Is literature in the world and of the world? Is literature something that is outside of that world? I mean, there are some implicit other questions in this question. And to what extent is your encounter with a novel affect how you live your life in everyday experience? Yeah. And I suppose I'll approach a question from several ways. In the 1980s, late 1980s, I read Erna Brodber's Mayal. She's a Jamaican writer. And in it, she described, it's a self-conscious novel about the ways in which our education system can be a process of of inculcating certain values and certain ideas. And so it represents a woman teaching in a primary school or in an elementary school a novel, a book, a storybook, and she starts to say, I notice that some animals are always put in a negative light, and some animals are always put in a positive light. And she's having trouble in how she's teaching these youngsters these ideas about themselves, some of them identifying with some of those animals. And she had a problem with it. And then there's a filmic representation of a woman. She goes abroad, marries a man who's interested in Jamaica, and he wants her to tell him all of her stories. And then he puts it in a film. And when she sees it, she becomes immediately ill because he has almost dumbed down in that filmic representation something about her culture and stereotyped it. And eventually, the novel is about the ways in which certain views about identities and certain privileged views about some people's culture work like a kind of spirit possession. Right? So she spoke about colonialism and imperialism as a kind of spirit possession that robs you of yourself and imposes something else on you. And in it is something of the idea of a kind of osmosis strategy, where if ideas keep being bombarding you over time, after a while it becomes part of your formation. And it's part of what I was trying to do with the theorist Althusser, who talks about the different ways in which certain social institutions like education, like the church, like the legal system and so on, sets up repeated processes of reinforcing the same view of the world, right? Black people are inferior and white people are superior. The male gender is superior and women are inferior. These kinds of stereotypical, hierarchical views of the world. And to a large extent, it works through a strategy of repeated repetition in a number of sites. So I do not think that any one book by itself might necessarily make that. But that book is participating in a whole network of the representation of these ideas. And if it keeps going on for a long time without interruption, then there's a way in which it becomes part of your formation. The solution that Erna Bradber, to go back to the beginning of my answer, suggested in that novel is that you need to get into it's your very reception of it that you have power. You don't need necessarily to applaud those representations being paraded before you. You can ask questions about them. You can interrupt it. And it's in that process of your critical response to what you receive that begins that process of destabilization and changing and interrupting those ideas. But of course, you also have to control the means of representation. It's very important that those people who use the means of representation use it responsibly to the extent that we create a more diverse possibilities for different kinds of people to have access to power and to be approved of and to be celebrated.